How could a massive aircraft filled with 239 people simply vanish from the face of the Earth? It might seem impossible in the modern era, but this is exactly what happened to Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 on March 8, 2014. There are countless theories which try to explain the mysterious disappearance. Everything from a remote control hijacking to exploding fruit in the cargo bay have been suggested. But what if the truth is even more disturbing? What if somebody on board Flight 370 was responsible? This is the chilling story of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, and it's a story that might finally help us find the missing plane. It was a clear night at Kuala Lumpur, the capital city of Malaysia. Monsoon season was coming to a close, and calmer conditions had arrived in the region. This calm extended to gate C1 of the satellite terminal of Kuala Lumpur International Airport, where a Boeing 777 operated by Malaysia Airlines was preparing for its journey to Beijing. The aircraft was being fueled and loaded with food, cargo and 227 passengers for the 6-hour journey north. As the passengers walked through the jet bridge, none of them could have known that they were about to become a part of the greatest mystery in the history of aviation. Despite the sheer variety of theories surrounding this night, one scenario stands head and shoulders above the rest. This documentary is one of the first tellings of a plausible version of that story in its entirety. In the cockpit of Flight 370 were 2 pilots, both of whom, in a matter of days, would become the subjects of intense scrutiny.
Delivery Malaysia 370, good morning.
Malaysian 370, request level.
370, we are ready, requesting flight level 350 to Beijing.
That's First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, requesting clearance to Beijing from air traffic control. This was a special flight for the 27-year-old. Flight 370 was his last training flight before being signed off to fly the Boeing 777. He had joined Malaysia Airlines as a cadet pilot 7 years previously, in 2007, and had flown Boeing 737s and Airbus A330s for the airline before beginning training on the 777 a few months previously. He had established an excellent performance record for himself in this time, and was assessed to be well above average during his progression through the ranks at the airline. In fact, he was doing well enough in his training that the airline considered it safe for him to be paired with just one captain for this flight, rather than the usual 2. And sitting to his left was that captain, 53-year-old Zahari Ahmed Shah. Zahari had joined Malaysia Airlines as a cadet pilot in 1981. In this time, he had built up over 18,000 flying hours. This was an immense amount of experience, and it made him one of the most experienced pilots in the country. Zahari held a senior position at the airline. As well as being responsible for taking hundreds of people around the world as a 777 captain, for the last 7 years, he had also been training pilots to fly the 777, and examining them to decide whether they should be granted their license. Zahari was described by colleagues as jovial, knowledgeable, and a true aviation geek, who spent his spare time flying remote control planes, paragliding, and inviting colleagues to his home to practice procedures on his home flight simulator. But in the scenario which we're now exploring, there was much more to Captain Zahari than would be suggested by his disarming exterior. At just before 12:30 that night, 8 minutes ahead of schedule, the jet bridge was removed and the massive aircraft was pushed back from the gate. It was now a sealed vessel, operating under its own power and untethered to the outside world. On board were 227 passengers, 10 flight attendants, and 49 metric tons of fuel. Some would later speculate that the captain took on an unnecessarily large, or even a suspicious amount of fuel, about 30 minutes more than was required for the distance. But the truth is that Malaysia Airlines mandated all Beijing-bound flights to take on 30 minutes of additional holding fuel, so there is nothing suspicious here. Zahari nudged the 777's throttles forwards and began taxiing out to runway 32 right at Kuala Lumpur. It was procedure at Malaysia Airlines that the captain should taxi the aircraft on the ground, while the first officer handled the radios. Once the plane had reached the runway, the first officer would take over and fly the aircraft to Beijing, with the captain handling the radios. As Zahari taxied out to the runway, the passengers settled in and tried to get some sleep. They would soon be in for a rude awakening. At 20 minutes to 1 that morning, the aircraft lined up at the runway. Ahead of it were 4 kilometers of concrete and a dark, open sky.
370, 32 right of takeoff, 9. 32 right, Captain Malaysia 37, thank you.
Captain Zahari pushed the enormous Rolls-Royce engines to take off thrust and then handed over control to First Officer Farik as their 777 began thundering down the runway. Within moments, Farik lifted the massive aircraft into the night sky and Flight 370 began its journey north. As the plane climbed out, Zahari contacted departure control.
Departure Malaysian 370.
Malaysian 370, selamat pagi. Identify climb flight level 180, cancel aside turn right direct to Ikari.
Okay, level 180, direct Ikari, Malaysian 370.
As well as clearing the flight to climb to 18,000 feet, the controller had given the pilots a shortcut, allowing them to go straight to a waypoint further along their route, known as Igari. This waypoint, Igari, is kind of an unusual one. It's one of the few waypoints on the planet which is bordered by a total of 5 different airspaces, namely those of Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam and Singapore. This fact will take on an eerie significance in the scenario which we're about to explore. The plane continued climbing out as normal, leaving behind the bright orange sea of lights that was Kuala Lumpur. Its flight plan would take it northeast over the Malaysian peninsula and then out over the South China Sea. Before long, the departure controller handed Flight 370 off to Lumpur Radar Control, who was responsible for a higher altitude portion of the country's airspace.
370, contact Lumpur Radar 13269.
Alright, 1326 Malaysian 370.
Zahari dialed this frequency into his radio set and made contact with the new controller.
Lumpur Control, Malaysian 370.
Malaysian 370, Lumpur Radar, good morning, climb flight level 250.
Morning, level 250, Malaysian 370.
So far, everything was going to plan. It was a clear, moonless night,